Okay, so we're doing our first deep dive, and many of you may have recognized that this actually corresponds to hub number 5. But if you pause again and look at it, you'll recognize that it really goes beyond hub number 5, which is the International Marketing Hub. It can actually be part of the competitive strategy that we will be seeing, and at the same time, it's part of leadership, and it's part of the act of going international, which includes the development and designing of organization. So that's why I've taken this opportunity to step aside from the normal course of subject matter in the class and deal with it specifically as a deep dive. What we're really talking about here is the internationalization process. And what I'd like to do first and foremost is, before I introduce to you exporting and finance, I'd like to be able just to run through what that actually looks like. So let's go ahead and begin. So we're going to be looking at the international process. Sometimes it's known as the modes of entry. Now, as part of that, you'll come to recognize that what we're doing is that when that very critical first decision is made, we're going to go international. Let's pause and let's take a look at that here in its entirety. What I'd like to do is share with you the modes of entry, as you saw. I want you to see what the roles of the various entry barriers look like. I want to deal with the export expansion, and particularly with regards to products, the difference between direct exporting and local distribution versus what is implied by that, indirect exporting. I'd like for you to also look at the export expansion with regards to services, and then we'll just briefly talk about finance, trade finance in particular, and I want us to be able to look at letters of credit. So let's go ahead and get started. As part of that, we're going to want to look at exporting. If we're looking at the modes of entry, by implication, what we want to do is, in the process of going international, we want to look at what we'll describe as the optimal mode of entry, right? We, as managers, are really going to find ourselves in a situation where we need to be able to guide that. And what does that actually mean? It means that we're going to go from one side of the equation to the other. On this one side, what we're really talking about is a domestic corporation. That domestic corporation, think about it as mom and pop. And you'll notice that when we're talking about mom and pop, we're literally talking about a very small entity, a very small company that has made that decision to go international. There's a lot of studies here as to how that decision is made. There's some really wonderful things. But to the other extreme, we're really going to go to a global corporation. And whereas I asked you to think about this as mom and pop here, I'm going to ask for you to think about this as Shell. In fact, it's Royal Dutch Shell, right? What you recognize, that's one of the largest multinational oil and gas exploration development companies in the world. And in that process, in theory, mom and pop should be able to drive to that point. How do they do that? Well, they go through that series of events. And the first one is exporting. And by exporting, we literally mean that they're looking at it with regards to importing. If you export something, you're going to be importing. The next one that we see is licensing. From there, we actually look at franchises, which actually comes here. I'll abbreviate that, franchising. Strategic alliances and joint ventures. Foreign direct investment. And really here, wholly owned subsidiary. Wholly spelled that way, right? And so what you see is the gamut. What we want to explore today is how you go from a mom and pop shop to a monster like this, Royal Dutch Shell. And yet, even though we're talking about an international manager, what we're really talking about is that the role that an international manager plays here is very different than the role they would be playing there. We continue in this development. What is it? we look at the various aspects. And what I'd like to do is look at each one of these aspects from that criteria. One is the concept of risk. I'll just put it with an R. The concept of control. And then most certainly the concept of knowledge. That's with a K, and I put a circle around that. The criteria by which an international manager is going to view these various structures, these various organizations, and by implication, you can obviously suspect that each one of these have its own unique organizational design. We're going to look at it through these three rubrics. And at the very end, and especially with regards to this one that has to do with exporting, what we want to do is see the concept of trade finance with regards to exporting. Obviously, if we look at this as knowledge, one of the implications of here, and I'll put it right up, is the intellectual property component. So now all of a sudden, this set of discussion points that we see on these slides now begin to have a process that may have been difficult for you to conceptualize. You'll notice, for those of you that really have looked at the book and looked at the course in general, that the concept of exporting is really one that's dealt with in the bonus module B. It's at the very end. And I ask you to take a look at it if there's something here that you may not understand, but in actuality, I think we should be able to drive through a lot of this. So let's take a look at this as exporting as a mode of entry. And first and foremost, what I'd like to do is go ahead and drive this down a little bit. You'll realize that out of exporting, you have direct, and you'll see it there on the PowerPoint, or you have indirect. Now, what I'm going to be doing shortly is I'm going to be grabbing this out of this entire spectrum here. I'm going to be grabbing this, and we're going to dive into this area, which is really the focus of today's deep dive. This is the focus, but I wanted to present to you where this all comes in. Now, some of you may ask, well, why are we focusing so much on export? Well, if you go back and look at this, exporting really is the first step that mom and pop take to go international. But you'll notice that mom and pop really don't have a lot of experience. And so they're going to be looking to obtain that knowledge. That's why I put this down here, right? They're going to look at what are the risks, am I going to be able to be in control, and what are some of the knowledge components. The way they're going to do that is by going either direct or indirect. Let's continue. If we look at now continuing within this licensing and we're looking at this progression, what do we see? We see that between licensing and franchising, there happens to be a bunch of sub-licenses, or what we may describe as various types of licenses. There can be most certainly a technical license. There can be contract manufacturing. There can be original equipment manufacturing as well, management contracts, turnkey contracts that lead towards franchising. Now, we'll take a look at this in deep dive number 2, but this is where this would evolve. If we continue down this path, we're going to be looking then at strategic alliance and wholly owned subsidiaries. Now, some of you may recognize that the concept of strategic alliance and a joint venture are sometimes confused. In deep dive number 2, we're going to look at how those actually are two very distinct issues directly related to the concept of risk and control, and by all means, how the knowledge transference, how you acquire knowledge by an association with another entity. There's that old saying, I'll tell you who you are by whom you hang around with. And so in doing so, how you structure strategic alliance is in essence a knowledge sharing. The last one is perhaps the most complex. In that last one, what happens is that now we're looking at foreign direct investment. And by foreign direct investment, the one that has the most amount of control happens to be a wholly owned subsidiary. Notice that term, wholly owned. By that, it means that you are actually 100% in control of that. But the risks change at that point. Why do the risks change? The risks change because we're now working at it at a very different level. Let me use a different pen to highlight this for you. When we look at this here, what we're actually looking at is, right here, and I'm going to circle this, is what we will describe as a buyer-seller relationship. And by buyer-seller, it literally, as we will see, it revolves around a transaction that is nothing more than a buyer-seller transaction. In this middle area, what happens is that here we're really looking at company-to-company transactions. And by company-to-company, it really has to do a lot more with what we call contractual arrangements. And those contractual arrangements become critical. Why? Because those contractual arrangements now are the bedrock upon which licenses of its various kinds, franchises, and strategic alliances are done. At this very last part, we have what we'll call company-to-government transactions. Why? Because many of you will recognize that when a company decides to go international and seeks to literally integrate into foreign direct investments or to establish wholly owned subsidiaries, many of those transactions are actually regulated by the government. So here what happens is that we actually find ourselves looking at a lot of the risks that we may just euphemistically describe as, and you'll notice that I'm putting that in quotations because it actually is a lot more. It can most certainly include, as we have seen, it could most certainly include political risk, it could include economic risk, it can include technological risk, climate risk, it may include legal regulatory risks and others. So notice then at that point, the actual dynamics begins to change. All right, so that leads us into the role of entry barriers. And what I'd like to do now is go ahead and pause for a second and explore that in detail.